We continue our series from 1 Corinthians. We're up to 1 Corinthians 8. And the next part, the key issue that the Apostle Paul wants to deal with is idolatry. Now, why was idolatry such a key issue for the early church? Now, if you were Jewish, you knew that idols were fake. And in our Old Testament reading today, we had there that Isaiah said that idols were no different to the firewood. That the man would get one piece of wood, cut half of it for firewood, other half he'd make into a statue and bow down and worship it. And thought, how stupid, he should have used both halves for wood and been extra warm. So what's it say there in Isaiah 44? All who fashion idols are nothing, and the things they delight in has absolutely no profit. Their witnesses neither see nor know that they may be put to shame. He plants a cedar and the rain nourishes it, then it becomes fuel. He takes a part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread, but he also makes a god and worships it. He makes it an idol and falls down before it. Half of it he burns for fire. The other half he eats meat. He roasts and it is satisfied. So as we see, Isaiah sees very little difference between the idol and the firewood. So that's how Jewish view would have been towards idols. And the whole way through the Old Testament we find that idolatry was one of the temptations the nation of Israel faced. What was it like, however, you were Gentile? Now all the Gentile converts to the Christian faith would have come from a culture and most likely come from a family that was obsessed by the supernatural. And they would have seen that the supernatural world was very, very real for them. So it's much like today how some people would view ghosts. And over morning tea you could have a massive conflict about who believes in ghosts and who doesn't believe in ghosts and all the stories. So it's that same sense of imagery that they would have had with idols. So how did their idols, what did they look like? The first is what are called fetishes. And that's where they'd worship for trees or rivers or hills or stones. The second is what you would call nature worship, where they'd worship the sun or the moon or the stars and see that the sun, moon and stars are the power behind nature. And of course that's where horoscopes would see their power. The third form is what we'd call hero worship. They'd either worship deceased ancestors or deceased famous heroes of the past. Now, is this an issue we face in modern day churches? If we were a Chinese church, very much so. One of the greatest struggles a lot of Chinese Christians have is how do you deal with ancestor worship, which is so invasive to the whole of Chinese culture. And the other half of ancestor worship is parent veneration. And if you're a Chinese person, how do you deal with these cultural issues you face? Now in Scripture, idolatry is regarded as being of heathen origin the whole time. It was imported into the Jewish nation through their contact with the heathen nations around them. Now our first allusion in the Bible to idolatry is the account of Rachel stealing her father's teraphim, or her father's household god. Now according to the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, which is an ancient document, a teraphim was made from the heads of slaughtered firstborn male humans. It was shaved, salted, spiced, then a golden plate was put underneath the tongue with magic words engraved on the plate. And it's believed that the teraphim mounted on the wall of your house would sometimes speak to you. And so that's where the first idol is in the Bible. Now let's look at Israel. As they go into Egypt, they go there as slaves, but the Egyptians had so many gods. A lot of their gods were nature worship. So Ra, the sun god, was to be worshipped. And so when we find Moses has his the plagues, each of the plagues relates to one of the key Egyptian gods. So when the sun gets blotted out, the Egyptians saying, that's our God you're blotting out there. You say, because the Christian God, the Jewish God, is more powerful than your Egyptian gods. And it took them 40 years in the wilderness to work through worshipping God, not worshipping idols. They enter into Canaan. They're ex-slaves. They're not really farmers. Suddenly they're in a farming community and they learn how to farm off the locals. And the locals would say, oh, the best way to get a good crop is to worship this god there. If you don't worship that god there, you don't get a good crop. It's like us saying use fertiliser. And so they were tempted by the gods of the Canaanites. They go into exile in Babylon. Of course, the Babylonians had hundreds of gods. Much more the temptation is there. We come to the time of Jesus, and of course the Romans had gods for everything. And the first Christians were called atheists. And the reason they were called atheists is say, you only have one God, we have hundreds of gods. You don't believe in any gods except for one. That's hardly any at all. You know, in my house I've got 20 statues around the house. You've got only one God, you don't have a statue of him. Now when we come to the New Testament, idolatry is seen as a far deeper issue, and it's regularly associated with a word called covetousness. So what is covetousness? It means being greedy, grasping, avarice, having a strong desire for material possessions, a strong desire for possessions that belong to somebody else. And how do we put it in modern day Australian? Keeping up with the Joneses. And so that's one of the struggles that they faced. Now, it's interesting, many Christian commentators, when they look at idolatry, will jump straight from idolatry of the Bible and live it all out and just go straight to materialism. And so our modern society, we don't have statues in the house, but we do have a house that is full of things that give us our identity. So how can you hide idolatry in our modern society? I'll pick some subtle ones. The first is shopping addiction. I had a lovely lady at a past church we were at, and she said, look, my husband's got way too many T-shirts. If I give them to you, could you give them to people who need T-shirts? So she gave me 40 T-shirts. I'm thinking 40 T-shirts, I've got maybe a dozen. Now 40 is huge. And she wanted to clear out her husband's wardrobe. Many of the T-shirts she gave me had never been worn. Many of them still had the original purchase ticket on the T-shirt itself. And I thought, gee, she's generous, until I reflected on it. She was giving me 40 T-shirts. Why? So she could go and buy 40 T-shirts more because I had no room to put the T-shirts. Shopping addiction. Now, in Australia, we live in a society of food waste. About 2.5 million tonnes of food a year is wasted in Australia. There's this obsession with food that we've got to have our fridges full of food, our cupboards full of food, and it stays there until the food starts rotting. And then it's surprising in some households, they're throwing up third to a half of their food gets thrown out because they're obsessed with wanting more in the house. Now, I've picked some stats that most of these stats come from American homes. And I think sometimes we may be a little bit worse and sometimes might be a little bit better, but we're going to be very similar. How many items does the average American house have inside their house? 300,000. Isn't that amazing? Now, the average house in America is 3 times bigger now than it was 50 years ago. And before we think how bad the Americans are, by memory, Australians have the biggest houses in the world. And so we've got to be careful when we throw stones at the Americans because we live in glass houses. We're going to break the windows in our own house first. Now, it's interesting. In America, and I know this is probably true for most of the units in our street here, 25% of people who have 2-car garages have nowhere to park their car because their garages are full of rubbish. So, and if you go along our street here, I know all the units have garages, and where do they park their cars? Out in the street because there's got no room in their garages. Now, before we think the Americans are the only bad ones, in Britain, in England, research says that the average 10-year-old child has 238 toys, but normally only plays with 12 daily. And so we have a house full of stuff they have not done. I have a relative of mine where the kids had so many presents for Christmas, they'd put a whole of them just away and didn't even bother opening them because they had too many presents. So how obsessed can we be? Now in America, nearly half of American households never save any money at all. They have no bank accounts, no backup plan. Now, currently 12% of the world's population lives in either North America or Western Europe, but but that 12% consumes 60% of all private world consumption. So how does that compare to, say, the sub-Sahara African and South Asia region? They have 1/3 of the world's population, and they consume 3% of the world's consumption. So you're looking at a difference there of maybe 100-fold between the two groups. Now, as we talked about, shopping can be an addiction. Teenage girls, 93% of them list shopping as their favourite hobby and pastime. So we're creating a society that is obsessed even from childhood. In America, they say they spend $1.2 trillion annually on non-essential goods. In other words, we buy things we do not need. And I love watching certain ads on TV for certain paraphernalia stuff, things like popcorn machines or specialist cooking machines. And you think, how many of those get put in the cupboard and then thrown away? And my great delight is I don't buy barbecues because I know that I can always get them for free off Gumtree or off the street, because people buy a barbecue with great intentions that a couple of years later they just throw it out. It's just one of those things that we consume. So what things do we do to please others more than trying to please ourselves? So the issue that Paul writes is, we can see how idolatry and materialism can be quite invasive. So going back to 1 Corinthians there in chapter 8, verse 4. Therefore, as to eating the food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although they may be called idols or gods in heaven or on earth, there are indeed many gods and many lords. So what is our Christian response? Verse 6. Yet for us there is only one God, the Father, from whom all things and from whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus, through whom we all things and through whom we exist. So there's a strong sense, as Paul's saying, there's only one true God. All these idols you see out there, I know people are captivated by them, but they're just fake. But he also talks to them and says he knew what their past was like. So there in verse 7 he says, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. So for some of these people, they struggle with this. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. Thus, eating food offered to idols has no bad side effects. Why was this such a struggle for them in Corinth? Because if you were a butcher, you offered all the meat you cut up to your gods. And you would even have statues. And if you go to a Buddhist shop, a lot of the bakeries, especially Vietnamese bakeries, run by Buddhists, and you'll find there are little Buddha statues there, and there'll be little food offerings and rice and other things they offer to those gods. So technically you could say, if I bought bread from a Vietnamese bakery, that bread has been offered to Buddha. Should I therefore eat it? Now, this was a struggle that Paul was writing to there, because it was a real, genuine struggle, because otherwise you have to be a vegetarian, because all the butchers would have been idol worshippers. So what's our response to be? Verse 9. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For everyone sees you have knowledge eating in an idol's temple. Will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? Idols are religious, but what temptations can we have? See, this is one of the struggles. If you were a Christian in those days there, you go to a butcher, just buy your meat, go home, people say, oh, he buys his book from meat that's been offered to idols. So you can see the struggle they face. But what are the temptations we may have? Now, in terms of religious things, if I cross myself like this, it's neither here nor there. But for others, they might say, oh, how can you do that? What about if you go to a Roman Catholic church, a number of them are full of statues. I remember meeting a lovely Catholic priest who went to a church that had probably 50 statues in his church, and every couple of weeks he'd slowly move the statues all and pull them all apart, and so one of the statues would disappear and go underneath the church. And over many, many years, the 50 statues have got down to about 8 or 10, and every so often people say, oh, Father, I'm sure we had more statues in here in the past. Oh, no, it's just in your head. It's just in your head. He didn't tell them what he'd been doing. So what about statues? Or for Greek Orthodox and the Orthodox people, they have icons that they worship. So you can see the idolatry, do you pray to a statue? Do you pray to a painting? What does that do? And in terms of temptations in our modern world in a secular sense, if you drink alcohol, could you lead people to temptation? I, for years in youth ministry, made a conscious decision to never drink alcohol publicly because I didn't want any teenager looking at me who admired me as a youth worker thinking he drinks alcohol, he must get drunk, therefore I can drink alcohol, I can get drunk. I did not want to be a temptation or a stumbling block to other people. Is it wrong or right to smoke? Is it wrong or right to take a sweep in the Melbourne Cup? There are a whole lot of grey areas as Christians that we need to examine ourselves and say, if I do this, will I be leading somebody astray? Is this of such value that I should be doing it? So what is the possible damage that could happen? Verse 11. And some by your knowledge this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died, thus sinning against your brothers and wounding their consciences when it is weak. You sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So Paul's reaction was, if there are things out there that are grey, do not lead people into sin. And so he's very, very careful there. Now, of course, people would say, what about my rights? What about my opinions? And he deals with this in chapter 9, verse 1. He says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? This is my defense to those who would examine me. And then verse 4. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Then verse 16. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. He saw his behaviour as a gospel issue, that he doesn't want to do anything that would limit or hinder the word of God. And he then goes on to see how much he tries to identify with all these different groups of people. He'll talk about those who are Jews, those who are not Jews. He talks about those inside and outside the law. And he talks about people who are weak. So what's he say there in chapter 9, verse 19? For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I become a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I become one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. What ways may we need to change to reach people? Then in verse 21, to those outside the law I become as one outside the law, that I may win them. To the weak I become weak. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in the blessings. Now it's interesting, it's over 40 years of ministry. What things have I done as part of my ministry that was not me originally? I have played a number of sports. I've done basketball, soccer, touch football, surfing and swimming. And each of them is because there were gospel opportunities. So when I worked in the inner city, I'd go and play basketball with a whole lot of teenagers who were probably half my age as a way of relating to them because they all played basketball. Here, every morning, 6:30, what I'm doing, down the beach, surfing with all the Newport knackers and all the old blokes, and then we all go out for breakfast. Why do I swim? Because I want to minister to those guys. And there's a whole lot of other people that effectively have, that it opens up doors. Over the years, I've built bomb cars, and I also built replicas because I saw that as an opportunity to work with people who were car mad. And so for quite a while here, I was sailing until it got too hectic. Why? Because it gave me opportunities to minister. And Paul was the same as that. If Paul was here in Newport, I could imagine him down the rugby union club or down the surf club. He'd want to hang out where people are and minister to them effectively. But he also warns us very effectively against idolatry. In other words, do things that can create ministry, but be careful that you don't step over the line. So there in chapter 10, he says this in verse 7. Do not be idolaters as some of you were. As is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. He then says we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some others did. Why? Because sexual immorality was intensely tied to idolatry. The two were nearly inseparable. And he goes in verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test. The third issue, he says, do not grumble as some of you did. Therefore, let anyone who thinks what he stands take heed lest he fall. Now, will we then face issues in our life? Yes, we will. Every day, there are different temptations that each of us will face. And none of us will face the same temptations. But we know this from verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. So don't get there and think, oh my gosh, I'm the first one to be tempted like this, because there's a million people before you. But what is our answer? God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with temptation he will provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. And so when temptation comes, don't blame God, but say, God, what alternatives do I have to this? He goes on to say this, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. No, I'm implying that what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. How shall we therefore live? Do all to the glory of God. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Take time to examine your behaviour, your lifestyle, and what you do. And how are we meant to determine what is right and what is wrong? Verse 24. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbour. Love God with all your heart, soul and mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. How do we love our neighbour? He then goes back to the idea of the meat that's been offered by the butchers. What do we do? Verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. You'll just go buy meat quietly, don't discuss the idols or anything like that. Then verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this meal has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, for the sake of their conscience. I don't mean your conscience, but his. For what should be my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? So how do we know what is right? And this is one of the greatest verses, and this one like a key verse for Presbyterians. Verse 31, so whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. When you cook, to the glory of God. When you talk, to the glory of God. When you drive your car, to the glory of God. When you have relationships with friends, to the glory of God. When you play sport, to the glory of God. I remember years ago, in the church soccer comp, it was regularly commented that the pastors were regularly the dirtiest players on the field. And a young man replaced me as a youth minister in one of the churches I was in, and the youth leaders were all horrified because he was by far the dirtiest player in the soccer field. And they're thinking, how can this man who's meant to be godly be such a dirty player? Because it was just wrong in every sense of the word. So for us as Christians, 24/7, 100%, all we say, all we do, glory of God. He then goes on to say, give no offence to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Live as a living witness of the love of Christ. And how do they know that we are Christians? By our love. We should be making a mark and making a difference when people say, oh, Christians, they're the ones who will love you. They're the ones who care. I find it hard sometimes because people regularly know my passions and will regularly give me overwhelmingly complex problems and just assume that I will find an answer. So I got a lovely text from a girl the other day. It says, oh, I've been talking to this homeless person. He needs accommodation, needs all these different things. Can you give me help? Now, they don't live nearby, so I couldn't just say, oh, you can live in our house. But I then went researching all the things, and she thanked me afterwards for everything I found. But I felt weak. I'm thinking, I wish I could just get the guy and say, live with us. Because this is what the scriptures talk about. We have that type of love. So was idolatry a problem? Yes, it was. Is idolatry and materialism a problem in our modern society? Yes, it is. But it's how we live can impact those who are around us. Let us pray. Father God, forgive us for the times when we put our confidence in our wealth and not our confidence in you. Father, examine our materialism, examine our motives for purchasing. Father, help us to be godly in all that we do and say and how we live. Amen.